The next speaker, I just met, Rebecca. She's with EAA. If you want to know a lot about her, there's a wonderful bio in the back. But I will tell you, she's not been with them long. But she is the geoscientist with EAA, and we're just really pleased to have her here today. Would you give her a warm welcome, Rebecca Nunu?
Thank you so much for the warm introduction. Thanks, Vince, for starting us off on such a high note. And thanks to our TAG organizers for the invitation to be here today. I always appreciate what we learn and discuss at this annual conference, and so again, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today. My name is Rebecca Nunu, and I recently joined the Edwards Aquifer Authority as a principal geoscientist. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit about identifying source areas to springs with a particular example from West Texas. This is an area that my colleagues Ron Green, Paul Bertetti, Gordon Whitmire, just to name a few, and I have been active in for the last several years at Southwest Research Institute. I'd be remiss, though, if I didn't start off by acknowledging the several groups and people that have made this work possible. The catalyst for our work in West Texas was a number of stakeholders were concerned about diminished spring flows in their communities. And so we got started with the help of Big Bend Conservation Alliance, where we were able to start taking a look at some of these iconic springs. Our work evolved through funding from Southwest Research Institute's Internal Research and Development Program. And through the years, we've worked closely with the local groundwater districts, namely Reeves County GCD and Middle Pecos GCD, who have been really helpful in allowing us to access sites and springs, get to know the communities. They've provided funding for samples and helped us push our work forward. So on top of that, we've also been able to expand our work in the area thanks to a U.S. Bureau of Reclamation WaterSmart grant. And so alongside our collaborators, Reeves County GCD, Middle Pecos GCD, the Horizon Foundation, the Nature Conservancy, we've really been able to push this work forward. So as Vanessa Puig-Williams likes to say, these are our water champions, and they've been instrumental in our success of identifying source areas to springs in West Texas. So increasing water demands and limited supplies are presenting severe challenges to many parts of the world. And this is especially true in Texas. There was a recent study that came out from the Meadow Center for Water and the Environment that found that since the early 1980s, the number of springs in Texas identified by Gunnar Brune that have gone dry has nearly tripled. And so nearly tripled relative to what it was in the early 80s. So in the early 80s, that figure was around 11%, and now that's grown to 30%. So this is a really alarming general trend of how the character and dynamics of our springs in Texas have changed over time in just the last few decades. So Comanche Springs is illustrative of those changes and those dynamics. Comanche Springs is in West Texas, and what was once a significant source to help with agriculture and support the local communities and was considered an oasis in the desert is now a spring that only flows intermittently throughout the year. Surface water in West Texas is quite limited, and so these springs in West Texas that are in this arid, semi-arid region are particularly susceptible to this general trend that I just described. Here's a map of West Texas from El Paso to Crockett County. Our spring locations as designated by the Texas Water Development Board are highlighted by the blue circles. Groundwater conservation districts are in our colored areas, and our GMAs are numbered and outlined in red. And so, as we all know, groundwater districts and political boundaries and hydrologic boundaries rarely coincide. And so the size and the complexities of these groundwater systems that feed major springs are often involve multiple GMAs, GCDs, and groups. Some of the major springs in West Texas include Caroline Springs at the Independence Creek Preserve in Sheffield, Texas, Hot Springs at Big Bend National Park, Diamond Y, Euphrasia, and Carges Springs in Fort Stockton, and San Solomon Springs in Balmorhea, Texas. And so in order to tackle any of the water issues in the region, it requires a very collaborative approach from numerous interest groups, GCDs, GMAs. And what I'm going to tell you about it today is San Solomon Springs and how successful we can be when that collaborative approach happens. San Solomon Springs is a multi-outlet spring system with uncertainty in the sources that feed its 6 springs. These springs are the lifeblood of Balmorhea and its surrounding communities, and they provide for agriculture, water supplies for its people, and tourism associated with the state park and the pool. This spring-fed pool is a regional icon. And there are 6 major outlets that comprise this spring system, and diminished flows over the years have motivated several studies to better rectify and understand these uncertainties that feed the springs. So, again, there are 6 main outlets, and they include, and they're listed on the bottom, Giffen, Phantom, San Solomon, which are our larger springs, Saragossa, East Sandia, and West Sandia. This is a box plot of total dissolved solids concentrations, and it's readily apparent that there are differences that exist amongst the springs. For example, Giffen, Phantom Lake, and San Solomon have similar ranges and median TDS values. East Sandia and West Sandia springs have elevated TDS values and don't often overlap with the other springs. And Saragossa Spring has much more variability and it has a little bit more similarity to the first 3. And so there have been various studies that have offered explanations for these characteristics, and while they were very well done, they laid the foundation for future work to be built upon, there are still uncertainties as to what can explain the differences amongst the individual springs at San Solomon. So we at Southwest Research Institute developed a tool and embarked on a different approach to solve this problem. This tool combines hydrogeology with geochemical and statistical analyses into what we call a geochemical framework. And so this framework includes sampling, analysis, and modeling, and it relies on the collection of robust geochemical data, robust in the sense that you're collecting a very broad suite of geochemical constituents over an extended period of time to capture any temporal variation that might exist, also over an extended geographic area. And then we use those data and apply geochemical and statistical methods, which I'll tell you a little bit more about in a minute. And then we hopefully end up with a refined conceptualization of our hydrologic system. And so applying a geochemical framework can be a really effective approach because you're using as much data as possible in order to identify what can often be very subtle but important differences that may exist. And so it takes advantage of modern analyses for various components while reducing the number of variables you might consider. And so when you pair this with specific geochemical data from wells and potential sources, we can discern new information about what might feed our springs. So as I mentioned, we started in 2019 with the collection of new samples from the 6 springs along with the analysis of available historical data. And then we expanded our sampling effort to include the resampling of the springs and wells to collect a total of 48 samples from 7 springs and 15 wells. And so the wells that we added were informed by our early results. And so what we tried to do was target critical data gaps as we continue to learn more throughout this process. And as you can see, this is the way that our sample locations have extended and grown throughout the years. What we really tried to do was target what we considered to be the contributing zone or the source area to our spring system. This wasn't always easy as well use has changed over time, and site access isn't always easy. But help from Greg and Ty and landowners were keys to our success in collecting so many samples. So this slide depicts what we mean when we combine geochemical and statistical analyses. This is a score plot, And what it shows is the results of a multivariate statistical analysis, more specifically, principal components analysis, or PCA. And PCA is often quite effective at combining several variables, in our case, our geochemical data, into a smaller number of grouped variables, what we call components, which are the first, our x and y axes, that allow us to compare many things at once and see the big picture. So the geochemical results from our 48 sample locations can all be analyzed at once. And similar to, so the first component is driven by our major ions, whereas the second component is driven by silica and nitrate. And so if you recall the TDS plot that we saw earlier, we noticed that there were readily apparent differences, but now we can take it a step further and better understand the different sources or what might account for those differences. And so we can partition, again, these results into additional characterizations by quadrant, for example, to really understand what might account for these differences. And so in essence, 83% of the variability can be explained using our two combined variables using PCA. So to take it a step further, we can start to identify the potential sources of water that, based on the groupings of our samples from the springs and wells, and we can even identify special conditions that might produce unusual results. Let me explain. So for example, Giffen, Phantom Lake, San Solomon, and one of our Capitan Reef samples cluster quite consistently and closely together. East Sandia, West Sandia, and the Pecos Valley alluvium do the same. The Edwards Trinity and Capitan Reef, other Capitan Reef flow that we sampled, also cluster quite nicely together, which might be indicative of the potential for mixing amongst our source waters. And we also have these outliers of Giffen, Phantom Lake, and San Solomon. And through this approach, we've been able to identify that these outliers are associated with significant rainfall in the area, which is another important component to know. So in essence, we've separated and grouped our samples in just one step. And I have to add a caveat here that, yes, we just took this in one step, but this was driven and made possible by numerous sample locations over many years. So yes, it's a very efficient way to analyze our data, but was made possible by a lot of work, a lot of data, and a lot of time. So in the end, when combined with some very specific isotope data, such as strontium isotopes, we were really able to crystallize the conceptual model of flow into San Solomon Springs. So for example, we found that the Capitan Reef and Edwards Trinity waters combine to provide the majority of flow to the springs. There were previously more distant sources that were thought to account for the majority of flow to the springs, but based on strontium isotopes, we were able to essentially point out that the Capitan Reef could be the source of these distinct strontium isotopic signatures that we see in our spring system. Moreover, East and West Sandia get some of their different chemistry from local interactions with the Pecos alluvium, and some of that recirculation of irrigation water or runoff adds to the mix. So again, using things like nitrate, the modern isotopic signatures that are exhibited at these springs help us tie an additional local source of recharge that feeds these two springs in particular. And again, those outliers that we saw are also an important addition of flow to the springs. Modern regional rain events recharge the Cretaceous rocks, where they're exposed along the flow path and add additional flow as a result. And so through the application of a geochemical framework, we were able to eliminate some proposed sources and isolate these flow paths that feed the springs. And so this is really important. I just want to add that using a geochemical framework is really an investment. It takes a great deal of time, resources, personnel in order to push this kind of work forward. But when we think about establishing our DFCs, our modeled available groundwater, developing numerical models that can really help us employ effective water management strategies. It's the kind of tool and investment that reaps rewards down the line. So our story doesn't end there. SWRI researchers are extending this approach to other iconic springs in West Texas. So work to investigate Diamond Y, Euphrasia, Cargis, and Comanche Springs in Fort Stockton, made possible by the Bureau of Reclamation and Middle Pecos GCD, has been ongoing. A similar approach has been taken, and thus far, using a geochemical framework appears to be a very promising approach in finding similar outcomes and delineating the source areas that provide recharge to these iconic springs further east. So in summary, as water demands continue to grow, it's likely that systems in West Texas will continue to be under threat or under stress from groundwater depletion. And so our springs in West Texas have complex political and hydraulic boundaries. And with that, it's important that we continue to collaborate and work together in order to make the most effective water management strategies to ensure that we extend their sustainability and viability as far as possible. Today, we've presented an approach that deals with the scientific complexities of these spring systems. Our geochemical framework combines modern techniques to deal with these complex systems, and it takes advantage of geochemical and statistical analyses and is really an efficient way to test multiple hypotheses. But again, I have to emphasize that it requires access and collaboration and buy-in from your water champions to be most successful. And so again, here's the geochemical framework and the workflow that we used. So as we learn more about the source areas to our springs, not just in West Texas, but beyond, we hope to learn more, identify new ways to continue to protect them for generations to come. So I really appreciate your time and effort. This, again, was the buildup of numerous years of work. This was the topic of my master's thesis and a lot of the work I've done at Southwest Research Institute. I'm so happy to see my colleagues at SWRI continue to push it forward because this is really important work, and I'm so proud I got to be a part of it. If you have any questions, I would love to answer them, but thank you.
Your favorite colleagues are in the room, so this is your opportunity to put her on the hot seat. She's in her new position, and I think your graduate studies, you said, came from that. Job well done.
Thank you.
Those of us in the groundwater world, we get giddy and stuff.
I get so nerdy. I love talking about isotopes, so.
No? Yes. You need to come to the mic. I'm sorry, they will not let me take a question unless your mic is on, because it won't go on the video. But all questions are good. We're going to let him switch out.
Oh, are we? Oh.
Well, hey, good afternoon. That's very interesting. I was hoping maybe you could touch on very quickly in the statistical analysis how y'all normalize the changes in the long-term climate normals, as well as change in mineralization with the diminished flows in the springs across the time frame of the study.
So thank you for your question. I think that what you've touched on might have been outside of the scope of our work. A lot of the work that we've done has strictly focused on the statistics and geochemical analyses, and the next step forward is the modeling. So my colleagues at SWRI are pushing forward extensive geochemical modeling efforts to tackle things that you've just mentioned, but as of right now, that's not been done. Thank you.
Thank you for your talk. I think in a previous presentation, I saw some data on rainfall events. And at the time, y'all didn't have that, or you hadn't run the analysis yet. I was just wondering if you had looked at base flow versus samples from rainfall events to try to quantify like how much is actually coming from the mountains versus what's coming from the regional flow path?
Absolutely. So that's part of the work being pushed forward again right now, and that kind of goes to his question about the modeling results, right? So What are the relative contributions from base flow from the Capitan and Apache Mountains versus the amount of rainfall that enters the system and provides for different chemistry? I don't have that specifically right now, but again, people at SWERI are pushing that forward, and the project for the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation grant ends in the fall, and so that work will be complete by that time. So hopefully next year at TAG, or hopefully sooner, I'll be able to provide those answers to you, but just know that they are on top of it. Thank you.
Okay, he already stole half my question. I too was wondering if you'd incorporated any analysis of rainfall, but also perhaps a local surface land use practices or anything like that that might have a possible effect on that.
Again, no, that's not been something we have directly evaluated, but I appreciate that perspective, as I do think that's an important thing to evaluate. But as of right now, that's not something we've done. But thank you.
Did you do any aging on that water?
We do, yes.
And how old is it?
So that's a good point. Again, I touched on how we really take a comprehensive multi-isotope approach to this study. And so these base flow waters are from the Pleistocene, so they're close to 15 to 20,000 years old. And so if that water runs out, that's how long it takes for the waters to recharge. So it stresses the importance of protecting the source areas because of how long it takes that water to get to the springs. But to your point, these waters are decades old. Thank you.
One more. Hey, Rebecca.
Hi.
Quick question. Did you consider inputs from the wrestler? Because you had Edwards
Correct.
Trinity, Capitan. And one note about the Capitan, it's really in the Apache Mountains, it's high and dry, and it's really the back reef carbonates that are saturated there. So
Sure.
I know nomenclature kind of gets a little wishy-washy, but something to consider. And then also, did y'all get any water level measurements and map out any directions of flow in the different units that you did your geochemical modeling on? Just kind of curious if that
Sure.
kind of coincided with your findings.
So we've taken, and again, this is the result of 5 years of work, and we have analyzed and synthesized numerous sources of data, one of which is the really wonderful Texas Water Development Board's groundwater database. And so we've taken big picture looks at what's going on regionally in terms of chemistry. And from our perspective and the data we've collected, the wrestler may be a component of recharge to the springs, but from the studies that we've done and the analyses of the geochemical data, our findings show that it doesn't have to be a significant contributor to the springs based on the geochemical assemblages. And so to take that a step further, we have looked at we've made and looked at potentiometric surface maps of each of these aquifers to kind of better understand the way that groundwater flows in our study area. And those potentiometric surface maps and flow directions are consistent with the conceptual model that we have worked to develop. Now, is it perfect? Could it continue to be refined? Absolutely, as with any sort of study or data. But from what we've seen and interpreted, our physical hydrology is consistent with our chemical hydrology. But again, we're looking to fill in those critical data gaps so that we can better evaluate other contributors.
Rebecca, we have time for one more question.
You got it. I'm so glad to see so many questions.
Hello, Rebecca. It's
Hello.
nice to see you present.
You too.
You did a very good job.
Thank you.
I've been watching you present this information for multiple of years, and I noticed that each time you present it, your confidence level rises a little bit more on the
Yes.
Capitan.
I didn't drop my microphone this time, so I am like light years ahead of where I was a couple years ago. So
I was wondering if you could explain what matrix is driving your increased confidence in the Capitan Reef as the kind of the primary charge for this aquifer system.
Sure. So previously, we worked really hard on evaluating the current conceptualizations of flow. And so there have been, like I said, numerous studies that have pointed to different sources of flow to these springs. And as part of our recent project, we were able to sample 2 Capitan Reef wells in Culberson County, which was a huge milestone in pushing this work forward. And so we have greater confidence in the Capitan Reef providing recharge to the springs because of the similar chemistries and, again, the strontium isotopes that help us link to that specific source. Previously, the researchers thought that the Wild Horse Flat was providing this elevated isotopic signature to the springs because the Cretaceous rocks in our study area tend to have much lower strontium isotopic signatures as they're all carbonates. It's sort of like the generalization. So there was this link to the Wild Horse Flat because the springs have this really high strontium isotopic signature. So what we were able to do in sampling those Capitan Reef wells was reconcile that or test that hypothesis, and because of the such high strontium values from the Capitan Reef, it gives us more confidence of the connection between the Capitan Reef and the springs. And so there are only 2 samples we've collected, but I think they've pushed us forward or moved the needle. Do I think we need more data? Absolutely, and I hope that that can continue to be done to test that and refine these questions or answers that we're trying to provide, but that's helping us have more confidence in the link to the Capitan. So,
Well, Rebecca, it's obvious, the metric is how many questions you've been asked. I think you win the contest of the day.
no.
There's a lot of people very proud of you and your work, and EAA should be very proud to bring you onto their team. Congratulations. Thank you.